Hello and welcome back to another Just Films and That new release special. I'm Josh Hallam. This time around we're going to be diving back into the world of the MCU with their latest offering, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. As with the other ones, I'm going to try and keep this as spoiler-free as possible, but if you don't want to know anything at all, then maybe give this a listen once you've seen the film. With this being a Marvel film, it probably extends to the other Marvel stuff as well, but I will do my best to bear in mind spoilers. Anyway, in terms of the plot, well, the film follows Scott Lang's Ant-Man after the events of Avengers Endgame. We find him sort of trying to live out his life whilst enjoying a little bit of quiet, but a little bit of fame, and a little bit of quality time with his daughter Cassie, who's now a little bit older because of the blip, and is now played by Catherine Newton, as well as the other returning characters we've seen in the other films, such as Michael Douglas's Hank Pym, Michelle Pfeiffer's Janet Van Dyne, and Evangeline Lilly's Hope, who is now also going steady with Scott in a relationship. During an experiment, the whole family are sucked into the quantum realm, which is where you may remember Janet had been stuck for the last 30 years in the last film. I'm not going to explain what the quantum realm is because I'm not a scientist, but basically it's like a little tiny world where there is a whole civilization existing and living, and they're all living in fear of the one they call the Conqueror, who turns out to be Kang, played by Jonathan Majors, in his first major sort of full-length turn as Kang after being teased in Loki, and as we know is going to go on to be one of the next bigger bad guys in the MCU. So, let's get into it. Overall, I didn't think it was great, to be honest, I have to say. It's probably not as bad as I think some people are saying. I think some people are acting as if it's the sort of bell tolling for the doom of the MCU, but I think they've made something like $30 billion overall, so I think they're probably okay. But I'd say this is okay to meh. If I had to sum it up, it's probably meh. But there was stuff I liked. I like the look of the film. It looks a little bit different, well, a lot different to the other Ant-Man films. It looks more like something like Guardians of the Galaxy. It's really colourful, and I quite like a lot of the design elements that have gone into the different creatures and beings that live in the quantum realm, as well as the quantum realm itself. There are also some interesting ideas then in there about how the quantum realm works and why it works that way, which I enjoyed. It's pretty well paced as well. It's more or less bang on 2 hours, and I didn't feel at any point like a moment had been wasted or that anything was dragged out. I didn't find myself bored at any point, as I have done with some of the more recent MCU films. There's some pretty good action this too. Unlike the other Ant-Man films, it's a lot bigger in scale, ironically speaking. So there's a lot less of the hand-to-hand stuff than there is in the first two. But there's some of that towards the end, which I thought was executed really well and felt quite visceral. And I think it was probably the best they've done it so far when you compare it to the other films. But as I say, this is a lot bigger in scale. It's a lot more epic. So there's some pretty good action sequences towards the end in the film's climax. And then finally, I'd say the cast are pretty good in this as well. Some of them are given more to do than others, which I'll come on to, but I just want to touch on two in particular. Paul Rudd isn't one of them, but obviously Paul Rudd is the lead, and he is as effortlessly charming and watchable as he always is, and it's good to have more of Michelle Pfeiffer in there as well. But I want to talk about Catherine Newton and Jonathan Majors, because they're the newcomers to this. Catherine Newton plays Cassie, who, as I've already said, is Scott's daughter, who's a little bit older now because of the blip. And I remember saying in the episode we did on Blockers that I thought she'd be a household name by the end of this year, and I think if she's not, there's something wrong, because I think she's brilliant in this. She's the real emotional heart of the film. She brings a real heart to the role, and I think she brings a real sort of naive, wide-eyed optimism to Cassie wanting to be part of her dad's life and change the world for the better. But the real standout for me in this film is Jonathan Majors as Kang. It's one of the real draws. And I think he really elevates this film with this performance. So some people have said before, haven't they, that there are good Marvel films with average villains, and I think this is probably an average film with a good villain. He is used sparingly, but the scenes he in are the most memorable ones, and there's something about his energy when he's on screen that you can't take your eyes off him. I mean, he's really physically imposing. He's quite a big guy, so that I think that does help, but he's also really graceful and refined in the way that he stands, and he's got really great, the way he plays Kang, got a really amazing posture, and the way he moves is really great, and there's a stillness to him, so when you're watching him, you're just waiting to see what he does next. He's definitely a cut above of some of the other Marvel villains we've seen, and I think there's a lot more to come from him in explaining his backstory and motives and what he wants, why he wants that. But otherwise, I'll say no more, because otherwise I don't want to give anything away. Anyway, I'll move on to things that I didn't really like. I'm not going to labour the point too much, because that's not really what we're about on this podcast, but there are some issues. I think one of the first issues is a little bit... It's how formulaic it is, I have to say. I think it's lost some of what the other Ant-Man films have, and it's tried to make up with them in other ways, so it feels a little bit tonally all over the place. So what I like about the others is that they're very much set in the real world, and you have normal people interacting with the characters. So like Cassie's mum and her husband and Scott's ex-con friends, and all that's missing here because it's entirely set in the quantum realm. So what they do is they try and make up for it with jokes about the quantum realm in that almost self-referential, oh, isn't it all weird, nodding to the camera sort of way. And I found that to be a little bit tired. Similarly, I think there's something missing with scale. Now, when I talk about scale, I don't mean what I meant before, like in that the film is bigger in scale. The film is bigger in scale, but what I mean here is the first two Ant-Man films played around with scale to give us an interesting cinematic experience, and they went to a lot of effort to show scale and to use it. You know, the whole thing is he can shrink and he can grow bigger, and they did stuff with that to give you an interesting cinematic experience. So, for example, in the first one, you have the bit where he gets flushed down the drain, and that's really good. That's really visually engaged and felt really cinematic. But you don't really get that in this because it's all set in the quantum realm. So he's shrinking and he's growing for what he needs to do in the film, but you don't, because it's all CGI, you don't really get a grasp of how big everything is, so it doesn't really have as much impact. And I do like the designs and visuals of the quantum realm, but if this is an Ant-Man film, and I wanted to see more of what made Ant-Man, and you just don't really get it on here. You just sort of get CGI upon CGI and end up with another heavy CGI, sci-fi film. There's a bit of an issue with character development as well. We do get more of Cassie and Janet, which is good, but as far as I can remember, Hope doesn't really have any kind of a story arc. She doesn't really have much to do other than being there as the Wasp to help Scott and have the same powers as him and be able to fly and shoot rays or whatever. I mean, the film's called Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, etc. And she doesn't... The Wasp has nothing to do in this film, which I thought was a shame. I'd also say, as I said with Doctor Strange, I think there's an issue here with the wider MCU, which is that it has a bit of a tendency to eat itself or become aware of its own success and then doesn't do the hard yards and assumes that you know what's going on if characters have appeared elsewhere. So in this case, I'd say it's pretty important that you've seen Loki to know what Kang is about. Now, it's not like you won't have any idea of what's going on, but the universes are set up so that they enrich one another. But even for me, I had to go away and read about Kang and remind myself of how he came up in Loki and what happened and what he's all about in order for this and particular post-credit scenes to make sense. And I think that's something they're really going to have to keep on top of. If they're going to keep using the TV and the film stuff to inform each other, then they need to make sure people know that, or they don't have to see the TV stuff to watch the films and vice versa, because otherwise you're going to risk alienating your audience, especially if you're going to keep using the multiverse stuff, because you're going to end up obviously with different versions of different characters and stuff like that, and it's just going to become confusing and alienating. Just to make a wider point too, I think the film suffers from what I've sort of called in my head as post-Endgame and Spider-Man fatigue, which is that the films are struggling to give us enough stakes to keep us interested if it's not all end-of-the-world sort of stuff with all the characters coming together in portals, etc., etc. So you get films like this that are feeling like placeholder films or that they're treading water films and no massive changes are made. So therefore, there feels like there's no jeopardy. I noticed this in this, and I noticed it in Love and Thunder, where you bring in these big baddies that seem unbeatable, but they're not. So what's the point? And then there feels like there's no jeopardy. There's nothing wrong with giving us small adventures, and if you do, then the bigger ones might feel a little bit more epic. That's just a wider point about the MCU, which does inform how I felt about Ant-Man. I know we're not talking about... It's difficult with the MCU films because I'm not talking about the other films. I'm talking about this one, but they're all stylistically similar and they're all set in the same universe. So it almost... They do inform each other, so it's difficult not to consider them. In terms of this specific one, it's what I've said. It's a bit tonally all over the place. It feels like a lack of jeopardy in places, and it doesn't... It just lost a little bit of what makes the other Ant-Man films good. good in the way that they play about with his powers and with scale in that sense. Overall, look, it's not doing anything new. It has its flaws. It's probably harmless enough if you want a bit of escapism. And I think if you'll like this if you like the Marvel formula at the end of the day, and it's probably worth going just to enjoy Jonathan Majors as Kang, to be honest. But yeah, until next time, the normal episode will be out on Tuesday. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.